coming out on a rainy night in Victoria. I'd like to welcome you all to the second event in the fall 2018 series of the City Talks. On the theme for the whole semester is the radical possibilities of alternative urbanisms. My name is Ruben Rose Redwood. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Victoria, and I'm also the current chair of the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, which runs the City Talks. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, and we're grateful to be here tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support of the Faculty of Social Sciences and the Department of Geography, as well as the EU Center of Excellence at the University of Victoria for sponsoring this semester's City Talks. Now, it's really my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Ted Rutland, who's currently an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at Concordia University. His research examines the racial politics of urban planning, policing, and community organizing in Canadian cities generally, but in the city of Halifax in particular. And he's the author of a book that just came out, it's hot off the press a few months ago, entitled Displacing Blackness, Planning, Power, and Race in 20th Century Halifax. And as you see here, he has some copies. If anyone would like to buy one at a discount tonight, you're more than welcome to talk to Ted after. Now tonight, Ted will be sharing some of his research from his book and recent studies in a talk entitled Urban Planning by Other Means, The Struggle for Racial Justice in 20th Century Halifax. So let's give Ted Rutland a warm welcome to the City Talks here tonight.
Thanks so much, Ruben. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. There we go. So as Ruben said, what I have to say tonight is drawing. Is this working all right? Yeah. Okay. It's drawing from this book, drawing out some themes that I think can help us to understand what racial injustice looks like when it comes to planning, and how a long history of struggle by African Nova Scotians in and around Halifax can teach us how we might think about how to make cities otherwise and how to plan otherwise. The book, as Ruben said, is available for a discounted price here, but it's also available at the UVic Library if you're in and around there. And I'm told it's on order at the Victoria Public Library, so you don't have to buy the thing. So in what follows, I will read a short section from the introduction of the book, and then I'll put the book down and unpack some of the major themes of the book, and then I'll pick up the book again at the end and read just a tiny bit from the conclusion. So here we go. Urban planning in Halifax is and has always been a world-altering instrument of power and race. As an East Coast settler city founded in 1749, its existence is owed to the planned creation of a white settler city from scratch and the planned dispossession and murder of the native Mi'kmaq. This exercise of violent sovereign power, entwined with planning, achieved its most gruesome effects in the 18th century, but it has endured into the still colonial present as well. In the second half of the 19th century, urban planning acquired a new form as city leaders in Halifax began to introduce a set of techniques, forms of knowledge, and objectives that they described as modern. This newer, modern form of planning tended to be concerned less with securing physical territory than with producing and regulating material conditions in such a way that human life was protected and improved. Whereas Halifax's first planners sought to establish a territory that could be controlled and administered by the colonial state, an exemplary modern planning initiative would seek to, quote, protect the physical and moral health of city residents, make the city a, quote, more agreeable place to live in, or, quote, improve the general welfare of the population. The pursuit of such objectives from the late 19th century onward reworked and rearranged the ground of colonized territory. Significant planning initiatives in 20th century Halifax included the development of sewers and water systems, the establishment of building codes and property development regulations, the demolition of impoverished slums, and the redesign of the city's public spaces. In these and other interventions, the remaking of physical spaces through planning was meant to act upon individuals and populations, to protect and improve people's lives according to period-specific conceptions of human flourishing. The arrival of these new planning initiatives was accompanied by new and complex forms of subjugation. As I explain in the book, modern planning's attention to human flourishing has gone hand in hand with various forms of physical displacement, political exclusion, sanctioned exposure to dangerous living conditions, imposed impediments to good health or welfare, and enforced restrictions on people's movements and daily activities. In some cases, these adverse effects were traceable to the exemption of certain lives from the sphere of planning's concerns. The terrain of life that planning sought to safeguard simply didn't extend this far. In other cases, adverse effects are more intimately connected to the operation of modern planning. Here, it is precisely through targeted degradation and subjugation that planning seeks to promote a better form of life, either for the broader population or for the adversely affected residents themselves. In all cases, the line between lives improved and lives degraded was been written most clearly and indelibly in the font of race. From the late 19th century to the present, evolving conceptions of race have shaped the meaning of life that planning has sought to secure and nurture, and have contributed to planning outcomes that were racialized in both self-evident and surreptitious ways. While Halifax planners' horrific overt war against the Mi'kmaq has ceased, the city's black residents have experienced modern planning as an unyielding source of imperilment and plunder. These residents, who have numbered between 8,000 and 20,000 people in the 20th century, are largely the descendants of formerly enslaved people who migrated to the region between 1783 and 1834 and were forced by the state to settle in a series of segregated communities outside white cities and towns. This slide shows 7 important black communities on the outskirts of Halifax. Modern planning, my book argues, is formed by particular entanglements with power and race. The power of modern planning is expressed less in the creation of sovereign territory than in the creation of material conditions that act upon individuals and populations. The creation through spatial means of tangible improvements in human health, happiness, and well-being. The paradox of modern planning is that these seemingly benevolent aims are structured by evolving normative conceptions of what it means to be a human being. Many social groups have thus found themselves on the outside of the conception of life that planning seeks to safeguard and nurture at a given point in time. And yet, life's pathological outside has been defined and populated most consistently by the city's black residents, and a deep-rooted structure of anti-blackness has shaped planning's dealings with all city residents, black and non-black. This structure, this expression of racial power, is the focus of the book. The book traces the connections between planning, power, and race across more than a century of history in Halifax. Seeking to illuminate both constants and variations in the operation of planning, each chapter documents the emergence and consequences of a particular planning, vision, or project, a particular effort to improve life as planning understood it. The book, while attending to diverse and not always racial forms of subjugation, advances the argument that anti-blackness is fundamental to the operation of modern planning. The moves of modern planning, its attempts to create a life-improving public urban terrain, are rendered conceivable and achievable by the displacement of blackness. This displacement is sometimes physical displacement, and sometimes symbolic, a displacement from the field of planning's concerns. Displacing blackness, physically and symbolically, is the unending work of modern planning. And so that's a section from the introduction, and it's a dense bit. So we'll unpack that a bit in what follows. Before we go through some of the themes of the book, I want to acknowledge the particular social conditions in which this talk is taking place. We are, of course, a long way from Halifax, but we're not outside the orbit of anti-black racism or black displacement. Victoria has its own history of anti-blackness that dates back at least to the 1850s, when 600 black Americans were lured to move to Victoria by Governor James Douglas and faced an almost immediate violent white backlash. These black migrants to Victoria soon found their citizenship rights removed by the courts and encountered a wall of racial segregation in Victoria restaurants, hotels, saloons, and entertainment venues like the Colonial Theatre. And so this is a discussion of racial segregation at the Colonial Theatre in a poem by a Vancouver-based poet named Wade Compton. Things did not get better from there. By the 1920s, the British Columbia chapter of the Ku Klux Klan boasted of having 10,000 members. BC, swimming pools and hotels remained racially segregated until the mid-20th century. And in the present, problems of Black invisibility and isolation remain intact, as Wilma Brown, who spoke at the last City Talks event, illuminated. And so we need to think about how all of this is connected to where we are. Beyond these geographical conditions, I want to acknowledge the ways that my own ability to write a book as a white scholar depends on various racial privileges that depend partly on anti-Blackness. And the analysis of the book draws on centuries of work by Black intellectuals. And by Black intellectuals here, I just mean people who think critically about the society. I don't mean people who are professors and write books. Some of these Black intellectuals that I draw on in the book had university positions and research grants, but others worked in incredibly challenging conditions, including developing ideas on plantations and in prisons. And so these people did not have the support that I had when they were doing their work. And so this book rests on the courageous work of others. The contribution of the book, which is actually a quite modest one, is to connect this long line of intellectual production to the planning archive, and therefore to put a little bit more evidence behind Black intellectual and political claims. And so I hope as we proceed, this long line of work by others remains in the foreground, and that my talk acts partly as an invitation and perhaps a prodding to engage with this line of work if you haven't already. So the book has three major aims, and I'll speak about each one of them for about 10 minutes. The first aim of the book, as I discussed in the introduction, is to try to locate the specificity of racial oppression vis-a-vis other forms of oppression, like class oppression, and to find that form of oppression at the very heart of the way that planning conceives of its work and achieves its impact in the city. Now, the existing literature on planning should do this, but doesn't quite do that. It's not that existing studies of planning don't show that planning sometimes commits harm against communities of color and Indigenous communities. It would be hard not to acknowledge that. The problem is actually a kind of subtle one. The problem is that when authors try to explain how these bad outcomes occur in communities of color, the explanation is usually that communities of color are more likely to be poor, and therefore are more likely to lack the resources and political power to fight off harmful planning projects. And that's certainly part of the story, but it problematically translates a position in a racial hierarchy, racial oppression, into class oppression, poverty. Racism is still relevant to the analysis here. It's what racism exists in places like the labor market, the education system. All of these things are the reason that communities of color are more likely to be poor. But by placing racism elsewhere, it ends up describing planning as this unique realm in the society where planning doesn't exist. Planning is impacted by the racism that occurs elsewhere, but it is not itself involved in the creation of racial ideas and the cementing of racial hierarchies. And so my questions that kind of animate the first part of this book project is how can we think and write about planning in a way that recognizes the distinct effects of racism on its operation and locates that racism at a sort of ingrained and deeply rooted place in the way that planning operates. Is to think of racism as something that shapes planning continually in the same way that we know that capitalism shapes planning in a continual way. Now these questions that I'm pursuing in this work didn't arise just from a critical reading of the planning literature. They're questions that are opened up by a long line of Black social and political thought in Halifax and elsewhere. In Halifax, these questions are opened up most elegantly by the African Nova Scotian poet, historian, and filmmaker Sylvia Hamilton. Sylvia Hamilton, in a poem titled Melville Island, writes, "Come in from the fields one day to find out we've been up and sold. We invented temporary." Now this passage, this description of forced geographical temporariness, raises questions for me about the way that conceptions of racial Blackness during the time of slavery shaped the spatial regulation of Black lives and spaces, and perhaps some of those ideas and practices carried into the present as well. Among academics, compatible insights can be found in the work of a whole range of scholars, including Sophia Hartman, Sylvia Winter, and Catherine McKittrick. These scholars, in their various ways, point out the way that European modernity produced new conceptions of human being, or simply the human. It involved new discourses about human nature, human capacities, human needs, new conceptions of what it meant to advance, to progress, to evolve, and simply to be well. Now, these new conceptions of what it meant to be a human being were both concurrent with and complicit with ongoing acts of European colonization and enslavement, because the people who were colonized and enslaved were placed outside of what it meant to be a human being. These populations, enslaved and colonized, constituted either the limit or the outside of what it meant to be human, and that's what justified taking their land or taking their bodies under control. And both Saidiya Hartman and Sylvia Wynter locate these new conceptions that are essentially racist conceptions of the human being in this vast period of colonization and enslavement, but both of them suggest that this is carried into the present in complex ways. All of this work, to me, raises some provocative questions about planning. So if planning, as I've suggested, is an operation concerned with human life, and if conceptions of human life have historically and presently been anti-Black, then how could planning be anything other than anti-Black? I think it can be, but we should suspect that it's going to be anti-Black unless it's forced not to be. So one of the ways that I try to connect these sort of large ideas to the planning archive is to look at the formation of modern planning itself. So modern planning emerged in the middle of the 1800s in North America and Western Europe with a bunch of isolated, somewhat incoherent interventions. So we can see efforts to improve public health through planning in cities like Paris, London, New York, Toronto, Montreal. Many of the same ideas, many of the same practices were implemented. By the 1910s, this collection of disparate, incoherent practices becomes a relatively coherent project. Where is it? Right. So planning in this era involved the work of a diverse range of actors. It included the work of public health doctors, philanthropists and voluntary organizations, architects, engineers, lawyers, elected officials, housing inspectors. It involved new forms of knowledge, including public health statistics, property assessment data, maps, surveys, and a whole set of new policies that would shape the way that planning could happen. It finally involved a set of interventions that would seek to improve life in various ways. And so I put these interventions under three categories. The first is a whole series of interventions concerned with public health, and particularly the prevention of infectious diseases. So important interventions here included the creation of sewers and water systems, the establishment of building codes and building inspections, and the establishment of land use zoning, so the separation of uses of land into residential, commercial, and industrial uses. Alongside this were a second set of interventions that were concerned with what planners called convenience, contentment, or eventually simply well-being. Important interventions here included the paving of streets and sidewalks, the installation of street lighting, and the creation of fancy boulevards and public parks. A final set of interventions were concerned with the economic or efficient use of land, making the best possible use of land in an economic way. Important interventions here included the imposition of higher taxes on vacant land or under-improved land, land use zoning, again, which was partly a way to protect residential property values, and then the expropriation of land at times that was either vacant or deemed to be using the land in a less than economic or less than efficient way. What all of these forms of intervention have in common is their concern with the condition of life. They're concerned with human life in its various facets, including its health, contentment, and economic prosperity. These ideas came together in a series of town planning conferences across North America, the most significant one for Canadian purposes happening in 1914 in Toronto, and led to a conception of planning outlined by Halifax's first bona fide planner, Francis Doane, who writes, "The health of the people is planning's first care, convenience next, with economy considered all through." In practice, these concerns with human life had their limits, and these limits were most visible in the community of Africville. Africville at the time was a 300-person all-Black community on the northern edge of the peninsula. If we look at what planning was doing in this era of concern with life, we see a couple of things. First, we see that all of planning's efforts to create a better life elsewhere in the city were not made in Africville. Simultaneously, the planning did make a whole series of interventions that imperiled and degraded life in Africville. And many of the interventions that imperiled and degraded life in Africville were meant to improve life overall, in the particular way that planners thought of overall life. And so, for example, in the early 1900s, a whole series of health-impairing medical and industrial facilities were moved from white neighborhoods to Africville in the name of public health. In 1915, moreover, the city proposed a plan to expropriate and redevelop all of Africville in order to improve the economic life of the city. Now, these outcomes shouldn't be that surprising when we think about the way that human life was conceived in modernity, and especially in this particular historical period. It is seldom noted that modern professional planning was founded at the height of scientific racism in Canada, the United States, and Western Europe. By scientific racism here, I mean a way of thinking about people that sees communities of color not just as inferior to white people, but as a kind of polluting presence within the overall population or nation, a presence that holds the country back, that leaves it unhealthy, that leaves it weak, something that needs to be contained. Planning, attuned to this perspective of what life meant, ended up being concerned with protecting and proliferating white life, and only white life. In this way, it ultimately put the urban terrain in the service of white life and produced a series of improvements in white health, contentment, and prosperity alongside and through the creation of Black dispossession, vulnerability, and death. Everything that happened in Africville was consistent with the way that planning was thinking about this benevolent aim of improving life. Everything that it did was consistent with the improvement of life in the specific racially constricted ways that planning had conceived it. Now, these negative effects in Africville were indeed racially based. And so I want here to contrast them with the way that class oppression operated in this same period. And so there was a plan to demolish a poor white part of the city, known as the upper streets. This area was planned to be demolished just a few years before the first plan to demolish Africville. Here again, people would be removed from their homes, the land would be taken by the city. However, those people who were removed were meant to be placed in new model tenements that would be built in the place of the former slough. And so this is certainly a form of oppression, it's a form of coercion. People are being forcibly removed from their homes and put into housing that someone else has judged to be good for them, but no one ever asked them, and a form of housing quite conveniently, they would kind of build in forms of surveillance and discipline in order to kind of control people's lives. But it is, nevertheless, a plan with a vision towards improving people's lives. And indeed, the plan was meant to take these poor white people and move them kind of closer in their habits and condition to bourgeois white people, which would widen the gap between white people as a group and Black people. And so this, then, is the difference between race oppression and class oppression in this specific moment. It's the difference between a kind of benevolent oppression and a malevolent oppression. It's the difference between lives that are seen as pathological and degraded, but improvable, and lives that are written off entirely. And so this racial logic, which was present at the very founding of modern professional planning in Canada and in the rest of North America, has shaped planning in this period and has never seriously been uprooted, and I think that it needs to be. So the second task in the book, as I also sort of suggested in the introduction, is to think about the way that racism operates across the urban terrain and how it shapes the urban experience in many multifaceted kinds of ways. Here again, existing discussions of planning aren't as helpful as they could be. When existing discussions of planning talk about racism, they most often talk about particular areas of the city, usually areas that are either inhabited or used by people of color. So the assumption here is that racism doesn't operate in white spaces, in areas where predominantly white people reside, and that to me is questionable. when these discussions do turn towards white spaces or white neighborhoods, moreover, they tend to conceive of the benefits provided by planning to white people in quite narrow ways. So they talk about the property wealth that white communities are able to accumulate, or they talk about the better schools that white parents are able to send their children to. And that's helpful, but if planning is concerned with human life in its varied capacities, then we might want to look at the effects of planning in a whole variety of aspects of our lives, including our bodies, our feelings, our emotions, and our experience of the city itself. And if planning is anti-Black, then we might want to spot the taint of anti-Blackness in these more intimate parts of our lives as well. And so my question here is, how can we write and think about planning in a way that recognizes the ubiquity of anti-Blackness? How can we spot anti-Blackness in every inch of the urban terrain, in every aspect of the urban experience? And so here again, these questions aren't opened up for me just by a critical reading of the planning literature, but by a long history of Black social and political thought. In Halifax, these questions are opened up for me most elegantly by the African Nova Scotian poet, novelist, and essayist George Eliot Clarke. George Eliot Clarke, in a 2001 interview, states, "Nova Scotia has this great, beautiful landscape, but behind it, or beneath it, is this incredible history of sometimes great pain and tragedy." So this passage to me suggests the need to look beyond these sort of positive aspects of the landscape or of the city, and think about the pain and tragedy that lies beneath it. And it's also to think about how that pain and tragedy is somehow linked to this great, beautiful landscape. How the upside and the underside are somehow mutually shaped. Among scholars, similar insights can be found in the work of a range of scholars, including two who are important to me, Joy James and Lewis Gordon. Joy James, in various places, has written about how the white civic body, the white population, is sustained and strengthened by what she calls a social parasitism, basically the feeding off the energies and lives of racialized others. Coming closer to the question of lived experience, Lewis Gordon says, quote, "For white people, there is something present whenever Black people are absent, and there is something absent whenever Black people are present." And so in both of these ways, well, for both James and Lewis Gordon, we can see the way that racism is shaping white lives, white spaces, and we can see the way that racism is shaping not just our income or our wealth, but actually our very experience of the world. And so I think sticking with these insights and thinking through what this means for planning can take us towards a more rich and profound understanding of how planning operates. One way that I seek to examine this in the book is to look at efforts made by planners to create a more vibrant and vital form of urban life. Now, these concerns with creating a more vibrant, engaging, exciting form of urban life is now a dominant planning objective, and it can be found in the work, if we can call it that, of people like Richard Florida. I deal with Richard Florida in the last chapter of the book, but here I want to focus on the emergence of these kinds of ideas in the 1960s, in part because I think looking at the emergence of these ideas can tell us something important about why Richard Florida's ideas are popular in the present. And so a strong interest in the creation of urban enjoyment emerged in Halifax in the 1960s. And here it was part of, again, a series of shifts in thought and practice that were common to cities across Canada, the United States, and at least Western Europe, and most notably France and Germany. An interest in enjoyment emerged here through the work of heritage activists, neighborhood associations, economic planners, specific business associations, pro-heritage property developers, there's such a thing, new planning authorities, and various other urban activists. These new ways of thinking about planning relied on new forms of knowledge, including economic statistics, theories of the knowledge economy, theories of urban design, maps of building heights and photos of architectural character, activist bulletins and posters, and oral input to various public consultations around planning. These new forms of planning were also bound up with a series of new kinds of interventions, including the creation of heritage protections, the renovation of old buildings, the imposition of limits on new building heights, the creation of pedestrian walkways, the reining in of car-focused transportation systems. One of the most important proponents of an enjoyment-focused regime of urban planning in Halifax was a short-lived institution called the Nova Scotia Planning Secretariat. And so the Planning Secretariat was formed in 1968 to coordinate federal investments in economic development in Nova Scotia, which was conceived as an underdeveloped or lagging region. We could just say relatively impoverished province. And so the Secretariat comes on the scene with a view towards trying to bring about economic development in the province of Nova Scotia, and it quickly comes to a couple of conclusions. First, it predicts, rightly it turns out, that first world economies were in the midst of a vast shift from industrial sectors to so-called post-industrial or knowledge-based economic sectors. So you could say knowledge industries, you could say high-level service industries. It also assumed that in order for the whole province of Nova Scotia to thrive, they needed programs that would invigorate these new sectors, these knowledge sectors, and that could really only happen in Halifax. Finally, it assumed that if you're going to make knowledge industries thrive, you need to create a kind of city that will attract and retain highly educated knowledge workers. And so ultimately, to benefit all of Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia Planning Secretariat says that we need to create a new kind of planning in Halifax. We need to create a kind of planning that is going to create a sense of enjoyment, that is going to capitalize on the distinctiveness of the city, that is going to make sort of streets that are pleasant to walk down, that are distinguished from other cities in Canada, and that make Halifax a place where people with the capacity to choose where they live, choose to live and work in Halifax. A similar vision of urban planning soon emerged in the work of an activist coalition called MOVE, or Movement for Citizens' Voice and Action. MOVE was formed in 1971. It brought together about 20 activist organizations and community organizations in Halifax at the beginning, eventually 40 community organizations and activist groups. And at the core, MOVE was just trying to get some resources together that could support all of the member organizations to do their own thing. In other words, they weren't necessarily trying to get people together to do the same thing, but just saying, it would be good if we were all better at the things we do. And so they got an office, they got a research team to do research on urban planning, propose an analysis of what was happening, what people could fight for. They created a monthly bulletin that included stories about what all these sort of activist groups and community organizations were working on and fighting for, to create a kind of broader consciousness of what people are fighting for in the city and where this might take us as a city. So while MOVE was primarily focused on sustaining a set of independent groups and organizations and doing their own work, it always sort of assumed that at one point or another they would launch into kind of a common campaign. And they did that only one time in 1972. And they did that to oppose a proposed expressway project called Harbour Drive North. And so Harbour Drive North was supposed to be a high-volume expressway that would run out of the downtown core, up the north side of the Halifax Harbour, and to a bridge on the northern end of the peninsula. And they opposed this expressway for various reasons. One, the expressway was going to harm, basically demolish a set of heritage buildings in the downtown core. Second, it was going to displace about 180 families in a working class neighborhood just north of the downtown. And three, it was going to channel all this car traffic into the downtown core, and therefore harm what MOVE felt was a potentially pleasurable, enjoyable downtown experience. And so in the course of this struggle, MOVE helped to popularize and cement a certain image of what enjoyment might mean, and to locate that possibility and reality of enjoyment in the downtown core. And so in an important activist bulletin that MOVE produced, they got to the heart of the matter by saying the following. In the past, the downtown was conceived of as a commercial and financial center, while residential areas of the city were removed to the suburbs. In the 1970s, however, the downtown area is thought of as a place to live, work, and enjoy ourselves on a 24-hour basis. And MOVE ultimately wins this campaign. The expressway is canceled, as these anti-expressway campaigns often did across North America and in Western Europe as well. And this is, for me, undoubtedly a good thing. But unfortunately, MOVE, in describing the downtown that way, failed to recognize the particular social conditions that were shaping the experience of the downtown. And so in the previous decade, 2,000 poor and working class residents had been displaced from the downtown by an urban renewal project. And Black activists in this period talked about the downtown as the most intense site of racial discrimination among retailers, employers, and landlords. And so the downtown was not a place to live, work, and enjoy oneself for a poor person, certainly not for a Black person, whether the expressway was constructed or not. And so there's a kind of limit there to who gets to experience this kind of enjoyment. And so, at best, this vision of enjoyment confines these feelings of enjoyment to a particular population. It delivers those benefits to people who can already live, work, and enjoy themselves in the downtown. It also turns attention away from a whole series of planning interventions that could have been made to make this space more inhabitable by the population in general, including tackling racial discrimination in the downtown, which might have made that space more accessible. At worst, this conception of downtown, of enjoyment, actually licenses ongoing practices of displacement, because it ties the meaning of enjoyment to a space that has been cleared of poor and Black residents. As Lewis Gordon might say, a feeling of enjoyment emerges where Blackness has been displaced. The emergence of Blackness into that space, moreover, might tend to disrupt enjoyment as it has been conceived. And it might be for that reason that downtown Halifax periodically erupts into what are called race riots, which inevitably begin when a Black person appears where they were not expected to be, and maybe disrupts an experience that white residents were expecting to have. And so if you can think about the creation of enjoyment as this potentially limited, potentially race-limited thing, I think that white people in particular can start to ask questions about what it is, what's happening when we feel enjoyment, what it is about an area, a neighborhood, or another place that seems to cause us enjoyment, and to ask critical questions whenever planning appeals to our sense of enjoyment in some vision to redevelop an area without explaining how existing barriers to that area will be specifically removed. And if we learn to kind of ask these questions and reflect in this way, I think we might develop new ways of feeling enjoyment, and we might learn to see discourses like Richard Florida's creative class thesis for exactly what they are, which is a rebranding of an urban liberal racism rooted in the 1960s. And so the last aim of the book is to think about how planning could operate otherwise. And so how planning could be taken beyond its present entanglements with power and race. And this is sort of the focus of the talk when I'm talking about planning by other means, the struggle for racial justice in Halifax. Everything we've done thus far in the talk is to try to get us to the point, I think, where we can really appreciate some of the efforts that have been made to transform planning in Halifax. And so discussions of efforts to transform planning in a way that prioritizes racial justice actually appear rather seldom in existing discussions of planning. In part, that's because existing discussions of activist confrontations of planning very, very frequently focus on white-led movements, including the inescapable, in some ways wonderful figure of Jane Jacobs. So Black-led activist movements tend to fall out of view. And they do that partly because they're placed in different categories. So we'll talk about Black civil rights movements, Black power movements, environmental justice movements. And again, these labels aren't problematic entirely because the movements themselves would tend to call themselves that. But if you think about it for a moment, aren't all these movements concerned in one way or another with urban planning? And so to take the civil rights movement for a moment, this is a movement concerned first and foremost with ending racial segregation. And what is that other than a fight with planning? The first zoning regulations in North America were racial zones. They were implemented in Baltimore to keep white and Black populations apart. More broadly, a whole range of Black organizations like the Black Panther Party frequently confronted planners and planning projects, and they envisioned new ways of creating cities and neighborhoods. Few of their proposals got implemented, but if we're looking for ways to create a better city, then we need to look partly to the unimplemented ideas of the past. And so my question here is, how can we recognize the planning future articulated by the history and present of Black struggle? How can we uproot the whiteness of planning history by centering Black struggle and the sometimes very different conceptions of planning and the human being that these struggles embodied? Here again, these questions aren't opened up just by a critical reading of the planning literature, but by a long line of political and social thought. In Halifax, some of the most important activists have been Rocky Jones and Carrie Best, whose work I'll talk about in a moment. In the Academy, we can find helpful ideas in the work of scholars like Fred Moten, Sarah Haley, and particularly in a recently published dialogue between Sylvia Winter and Catherine McKittrick. And so McKittrick and Winter in this dialogue reflect on the ways that that European modernity created new conceptions of what it meant to be human, that these conceptions were ultimately very racially limited, focused on European life, and often bourgeois European life. They talk about how the consequences of that aren't just that various people's lives are wrecked and degraded by efforts to sort of protect and improve life in its racially constricted conception, but also that entirely new ways of being, what McKittrick and Winter call new genres of the human, elude attention. And so they're saying, what if we looked at the model of human being that is expressed in the lives and struggles of people who are never recognized as human by dominant institutions? Are there not other genres of being human there? And do not those genres of humanity offer more promise for a livable social and ecological future? And so I think I'm sort of hitching on this idea of other genres of the human and thinking about the way in which planning might shift its attention to other ways of being and what that might mean for the city. And so this particular chapter of the book tries to look at the way that the Black struggle has produced new ways of thinking about what it meant to be human. And so Black struggles against planning and spatial regulation date back to the founding of the city itself. And so we can think of struggles to escape slavery, struggles to escape re-enslavement, the re-enslavement of free people, which was common in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. We can think about efforts to stop the theft of Black land, efforts to combat racial inequities in the delivery of essential social services like sewers, clean water, recreation centers, and education. We can think of efforts to desegregate public schooling and social services, and we can think of efforts to improve housing conditions in Black communities. One of the most important efforts to combat dominant planning institutions and articulate another future came in the work of an organization called the Black United Front. The Black United Front was formed in 1968 amid a worldwide upsurge in Black resistance. And we could see that in Canada in various forms. In the United States, we might think of Martin Luther King at Ella Baker and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We might think of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. We might think of the Black Panther Party. In Britain, we might think of the Black Eagles and the magazine Black Dimension. In France, we might think of the review Présence Africaine and the thinking of Martinican intellectuals who moved to France, Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. A lot of these currents of Black thought and activism came together at a conference at McGill University in Montreal in 1968 called the Black Writers' Congress. And there you're seeing Black intellectuals, who they're calling them writers, but a lot of them are just activists who are expressing something verbal or literary in their acts themselves. You have this sort of convergence of these Black intellectuals and activists, and there a Nova Scotia-based activist named Rocky Jones, who I just pictured, meets a whole series of important activists from elsewhere, including Stokely Carmichael, Miriam Makaba, Rosie Douglas, and two members of the Black Panther Party, who he invites to visit Halifax. And so a team of radical activists from elsewhere visit Halifax on 2 occasions and cause a great deal of alarm. In the second visit to Halifax, a quote-unquote black family meeting was held in the North End Library, where 400 black residents met behind closed doors, kept the media, politicians, and white people in general at bay, and discussed ways of changing the situation of black people in Halifax and across Nova Scotia. One of the outcomes of that meeting was the creation of a new organization called the Black United Front. And the Black United Front differed from other black organizations in two major ways. First, its leadership and membership would be entirely black. And second, the primary objective of the group would be to achieve what they call black self-determination. And so self-determination has been an important principle in the struggle of black communities and other communities of color and indigenous communities going back a few hundred years. It became especially important to black struggle against these decolonization movements in Africa, as well as these radical movements in black neighborhoods in the United States, Britain, and France. It essentially means creating the capacity for black people to determine their own destinies. And so this principle of black self-determination was kind of succinctly expressed in the words of the Black United Front's first president, Jules Oliver, when he told the media that black people would no longer adhere to a system that was averse to racial justice. That system would either be transformed, or black people would create their own system. So he says, your white system can function as you wish. Black people will function as we wish, end quote. And Black United Front existed until 1996, at least in name, but it was most effective between 1969 and 1974. Its concerns in this period were usually named as housing, employment, and education, but the group's work involved a frequent and really inspiring confrontation with planning as well. And so its confrontations with planning can be put under two categories. One, it confronted and challenged dominant institutions. That involved challenging racist hiring decisions at City Hall, including the planning department itself, documenting and criticizing the lack of services and infrastructure in black communities, challenging racist federal and municipal housing policies, directly combating racist landlords and employers, and calling for the removal of white planners and white planning consultants from black communities so they could plan their own communities. The second kind of confrontations involved the creation of alternative social programs or institutions. And here, the Black United Front was involved in the creation of community-specific recreation committees that would decide what kind of recreational activities and facilities were called for in the community and be heavily involved in the creation of them. BUF, that's their acronym, Black United Front, trained people to do housing surveys in black communities, and so they wouldn't have to depend on the state to come into communities and survey them. They created community-managed housing programs, and they created programs to advance black people's consciousness, analysis, and organizing skills. In all of these activities, the Black United Front was attuned to a genre of the human foreign to modern planning. Its very commitment to black life was a departure from the way that planning had operated. And so it insisted that black life was not sort of a degraded or pathological version of white life, but a viable form of life itself. It assumed that a better future was both possible for black people and definable by everyday black people. In some of its work, it simply sought to extend the benefits of planning to black communities. So all these services and infrastructure that had been derived from black communities, they fought to bring those into the communities. And so it's basically just a less racist version of planning itself. In other interventions, however, it devised quite new forms of planning. And so, for example, the Black United Front used federal subsidies to create affordable housing and used community-supplied labor to build houses. And so, if nothing else, this is a very efficient use of state resources, and so they were able to build more housing than they otherwise would have because they used voluntary labor. But it also affirmed this principle of black mutual aid that had been a commonplace characteristic in black communities dating back to their arrival in the province. So it's very common for black community members to work together to build houses for other community members. Like the children of one family get old enough to need their own home, the community will get together and build it. And so in that way, they're sort of embedding this principle of mutual aid and solidarity in the very operation of planning itself, which is a modestly different genre of the human, I would say. And so these experiments in planning by other means were ultimately rather short-lived. Through various forms of state repression that I detail in the book, the Black United Front could not continue to function the way it had been after 1974. But its example nevertheless lives on as an important vision of what planning could be. And so we see in the Black United Front's actions a major departure from dominant planning. Instead of displacing blackness and seeking to improve what's left, the Black United Front moves blackness to the center. When black particularities are noticed, as they sometimes are, they're not treated as pathologies, but as a viable genre of life that can be sustained and that can be involved in the improvement of community life from the grassroots. And so these experiments, while they ceased to be very important to Black United Front after 1974, have lived on in various forms of resistance, both sort of individual acts, spontaneous acts, and forms of organized resistance, like the efforts of a recently formed chapter of Black Lives Matter in Halifax. And so, to wrap up, links between planning, power, and race, the subject of this book and the subject of this talk, have shaped the lives and spaces of Halifax profoundly in the 20th century. In this period, planning took life as its object. It began with assessments of individuals and populations. It sought to improve the health, happiness, and prosperity of individuals and populations. And it used as its method the rearrangement of physical conditions. And yet, all through this period, blackness defined the limit or the outside of the life that planning sought to secure. Blackness, the displacement of blackness, made planning possible. The displacement of blackness allowed prevailing degrees of normality and pathology to be discerned, and made it possible for planning to devise interventions that would create more optimal forms of life through the containment or elimination of the pathological. Seeing planning this way serves three major objectives. First, it helps us to see the specificity of racial oppression vis-a-vis other forms of oppression, like class oppression, and to see how racial oppression operates at the very core of modern planning. Secondly, it helps us to understand how racism shapes the entirety of the urban terrain and the entirety of the urban experience. And third, it helps us to see how the history of black struggle is also a struggle with urban planning, and how that history of struggle points us to another way that we might make cities, a way that centers the lives of people who have historically and are currently harmed by planning. Now, all of these claims are meant to have wider purchase. We aren't in 2018 beyond the period of time that this book recounts, and we're not in Victoria outside the geography that it analyzes. And so I think we can all learn something from the work of groups like the Black United Front and contemporary organizations like like Black Lives Matter that embody a similar politics of self-determination. In all of their work, the speaking of self-determination, the basic logic of modern planning is uprooted. Rather than the displacement of blackness, these organizations seem to seek to move blackness to the center. Rather than seeing black particularities as pathologies, it takes black lives in all their manifestations as viable forms of life that deserve care and that can be involved in the creation of a better world. And so I'll read a little passage from the introduction that kind of tries to bring those ideas together. In practical terms, groups like the Black United Front and Black Lives Matter call for political authorities to cede the human and physical terrain they have claimed. They seek to end the ongoing process through which powerful institutions simultaneously assume jurisdiction over black lives on the one hand, and evict these lives from any desirable future on the other. For planning to heed these calls would mean moving immediately to redistribute existing authority and resources. This would involve, at a minimum, vesting decision-making authority in black communities, diverting planning-related monies and technical expertise towards black decision-making processes, and treating as illegitimate any municipal decision not made by Black people that significantly impacts their lives. Actions like these, when they are demanded by Black activists, need to be supported by non-Black allies. What groups like this teach more broadly is that a different future cannot arrive so long as white people cling to their own status quo. This status quo, this life that modern planning and state power have secured, is an obstruction to social transformation, even when its preservation is pursued within a social movement that also affirms non-white lives and interests. A different future requires white people to support and indeed prioritize others' interests, but it also requires something more than that. It requires them, it requires me, to leave our place within the boundaries of a conception of human being that is always dependent for its coherence on the displacement and dehumanization of others. It requires us to refuse the ostensibly better life that planning and other state institutions have offered us at enormous expense to others. The benefits of this life have never been and can never be universally distributed. They are predicated on exclusivity, violently defended. For white people to act against anti-Blackness, as Christina Sharp suggests, is to leave the terrain of recognized humanity. Quote, "One must be willing to be more than uncomfortable," she writes. "One must be willing to be on the outside." On the outside, a place that Sharp notes, quote, "Some of us have never had any other choice but to inhabit, an entirely different and genuinely better form of life might indeed be created. A new form of planning, one released from its centuries-old connection to race and power, will be created here or nowhere." Thank you very much.